I sat across from Dr. Patel in her office on Bloor Street, the fluorescent lights humming overhead as she slid the lab report toward me. "Mrs. Whitmore, I need you to understand what you're looking at. This is thallium. Someone has been administering it to you in small doses for at least 3 months." My hands wouldn't stop shaking, but it wasn't from the weakness I'd been battling for what felt like an eternity. It was the crushing realization that my body hadn't been failing me. Someone had been trying to kill me. Slowly, methodically, with the patience of a predator who knew exactly what they were doing. "Are you absolutely sure, Dr. Patel?" My voice came out as barely a whisper. She looked at me with the kind of compassion that made me want to weep. "Eleanor, your symptoms match perfectly. The hair loss, the burning sensation in your feet, the gastrointestinal distress, the cognitive fog. Thallium is sometimes called the poisoner's poison because it's nearly impossible to detect without specific testing. Whoever is doing this knew exactly what they were doing. Thallium. I'd never even heard of it before that moment, but in the space of 30 seconds, it had become the most important word in my entire 68 years of living. I should tell you how I got here, because I barely believed it myself until the evidence became impossible to ignore. My name is Eleanor Whitmore, and until last autumn, I lived a very ordinary life in a Victorian-century home in the Glebe neighborhood of Ottawa. My late husband Douglas and I bought that house in 1982, back when you could actually afford a heritage property on a civil servant's salary. Douglas worked for Natural Resources Canada for 36 years before his heart gave out on him 4 winters ago, right after a particularly brutal ice storm. Our only daughter, Catherine, had moved to Calgary years earlier with her husband Bradley, a commercial real estate developer who'd always struck me as a touch too slick, too polished, too eager to tell you about his latest deal before you'd even finish saying hello. I managed fine on my own after Douglas passed. I had my volunteer shifts at the Ottawa Public Library, my Wednesday evening bridge club with the girls from the old neighborhood, and my garden, which had won the Glebe Garden Tour's Heritage Award 3 years running. My neighbor across the fence, Margaret Chen, had become my closest friend since Douglas died. She was a retired pharmacist from the Civic Hospital, a widow herself, and she had a way of knowing when I needed company without me having to ask. She'd come over with a thermos of jasmine tea, and we'd sit on my back porch watching the cardinals fight over the bird feeder. Then, last September, my daughter called me during one of those perfect Ottawa autumn afternoons when the maples along Bank Street looked like they'd been set on fire. "Mum, Bradley and I have been talking. We're really worried about you being alone in that big old house, especially with winter coming. The stairs, the ice, what if you fell?" I laughed and told her I was 67, not 97, and that I could still shovel my own walkway, thank you very much. But she persisted gently, the way Catherine always had. "Just hear me out. Bradley's company is expanding into the Ottawa market. We're thinking of relocating. If we could stay with you while we find our own place, it would be such a help to both of us. And honestly, Mom, I just feel better being closer." What mother turns away her only daughter? The house had been feeling awfully quiet since Douglas left. Catherine and I had never been as close as I'd wanted us to be, especially after she married Bradley and moved west. The thought of Christmas morning with my daughter in the kitchen, of Sunday dinners with someone other than the radio for company, it filled a hollow space I hadn't admitted existed. I said yes before I could think it through. They arrived the second week of October with an enormous moving truck and enough luggage to fill a Pullman coach. I remember standing on my front steps, watching Bradley direct the movers, barking orders in that voice of his that always had an edge, and feeling a tiny flutter of unease in my chest. Catherine hugged me and told me how grateful she was, and I pushed the feeling aside. For the first few weeks, it truly was lovely. Catherine took over the cooking, insisting I deserved to be spoiled. She'd make me elaborate breakfasts, smoothies packed with kale and berries and something called maca powder, homemade soups simmering on the stove all afternoon. Bradley was mostly away, traveling to Toronto and Montreal for meetings, but when he was home, he was charming in his performative way, bringing me flowers from the Byward Market, and asking about my day with an interest that felt slightly rehearsed. By the second week of November, I started feeling off. Nothing dramatic at first, just a bone-deep tiredness that wouldn't lift no matter how much I slept. Then the nausea came, wave after wave, usually worst in the mornings after breakfast. My hair started coming out in the shower. Great clumps of it gathering in the drain catch until I had to pull it out with my fingers, heart pounding. My feet began to burn and tingle. a constant pins and needles sensation that made walking feel strange. When I mentioned it to Catherine, she immediately researched on her phone and declared it was probably just age-related peripheral neuropathy. Maybe a vitamin B12 deficiency, Mum. I'll pick up some supplements. Don't worry, I'll take care of you. She was wonderful about it. That's what made everything so insidious. She drove me to appointments with my family doctor, who ordered the usual blood work and found nothing remarkable. She made me special tea with honey and ginger for the nausea. She insisted on preparing every meal because you shouldn't be on your feet when you're feeling so poorly. She even suggested, ever so gently, that perhaps I should meet with her financial advisor to make sure my affairs were in order, just for peace of mind, Mum. You know how Dad always handled those things. That should have been my first real warning. But I was so foggy, so exhausted that I nodded along. Bradley had begun asking pointed questions about the house. How much had we paid? Did I know what comparable properties in the Glebe were fetching now? He'd researched it, apparently. Just over $2 million, Eleanor. Can you believe it? That old place of yours is sitting on a gold mine. By mid-December, I couldn't climb the stairs to my own bedroom without stopping to rest halfway. I'd set up a cot in the sunroom because the exhaustion was that severe. Margaret came over one afternoon with a pot of her mother's ginseng chicken soup and nearly dropped it when she saw me. Eleanor, my God, what is going on with you? You look like a ghost. I told her what Catherine had told me, vitamin deficiency, age catching up, nothing serious. Margaret's eyes narrowed the way they used to when she was catching a patient fibbing about whether they'd actually taken their blood pressure medication. Has Dr. Okonkwo seen you? I said yes, that everything had come back normal. Margaret didn't say anything, but she set down the soup and insisted on spooning it into me herself, waving Catherine out of the kitchen with a firmness I rarely saw from her. That night, after eating only Margaret's soup and nothing Catherine had prepared, I slept for 10 uninterrupted hours. I woke up feeling almost human. The fog in my brain had lifted slightly. The nausea was barely there. When I mentioned this to Catherine over my usual morning smoothie, her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. That's lovely, Mum. Maybe Margaret's soup has some magic in it. But I noticed something then that I hadn't noticed before. A tiny tightness around her jaw. A flicker of something cold in her gaze before she looked away. And I started to pay attention. Really, truly pay attention. The way I used to when I worked as an investigator for the provincial ombudsman's office before I retired. The instincts were still there. They'd just been buried under 30 years of being a wife and mother and citizen of a country that teaches you to trust your family above all else. The next morning, I watched Catherine carefully from behind my newspaper as she prepared my smoothie. She put in the usual ingredients: frozen berries from the freezer, spinach, yogurt, almond milk, protein powder. Then she did something that made my blood run cold. She glanced over her shoulder toward the hallway, opened a cupboard above the fridge, the one I'd always kept empty because it was too high for me to reach, and took down a small amber-colored glass bottle. She unscrewed the top, tilted a few drops into the blender, and then tucked the bottle back up high, hiding it behind a stack of unused serving platters. My heart was hammering so hard I thought she'd hear it from across the kitchen. She brought me the smoothie with that same practiced smile. "Drink up, Mum. It'll help you get your strength back." I took the glass. I thanked her. I waited until she'd gone upstairs to shower, and then I poured every last drop of it down the kitchen drain and rinsed the glass 3 times. I called Margaret from my bedroom with trembling fingers. "I need your help. I need to see a doctor, and I need Catherine and Bradley to know nothing about it." Margaret didn't ask questions. She just said, "I'll pick you up in 20 minutes. She'd called her niece, Dr. Priya Patel, who ran an internal medicine practice downtown and who specialized in unusual cases. Priya saw me that same afternoon, squeezed me in between appointments as a favor. She listened to my symptoms with a growing look of concern. She took blood, urine, hair samples. She told me it might take a week to get the specialized toxicology panel back from the lab in Toronto. She also told me something that chilled me to my core. "Mrs. Whitmore, with this symptom profile, I'd recommend you not eat or drink anything prepared by the people in your household until we have answers. Can you find a way to do that without raising suspicion?" That night, I started a careful campaign of deception. I told Catherine I'd started a new dietary protocol my doctor had suggested for the neuropathy, one that required me to prepare my own meals using only very specific ingredients. She pushed back at first, clearly rattled, but I held firm. "It's doctor's orders, dear. Just for a few weeks to see if it helps." I watched something calculating flash across her face before she smoothed it over with concern. "Of course, Mum. Whatever you need." I started feeling better almost immediately. Within 3 days, the brain fog had lifted significantly. The nausea was gone. I could actually taste food again, something I hadn't even realized I'd been missing. And then, a week after my appointment, Dr. Patel called. "Eleanor, I need you to come in as soon as possible. And please, bring someone you trust completely." That's how I ended up in her office, staring at the word thallium on a report I didn't fully understand but knew, in the deepest part of me, meant my daughter had been trying to kill me. "What do I do?" I asked, my voice sounding very far away. "You go to the Ottawa Police Service immediately," Dr. Patel said firmly. "This is attempted murder. I'll write a report and share everything with the detectives. I can arrange a safe place for you to stay tonight if you need it." But on the drive back to Margaret's house, something began to shift inside me. A cold, clear, deliberate fury settled into my bones. I'd spent 30 years as an investigator. I knew how these cases fell apart. I knew how often family members walked free because the evidence wasn't ironclad, because prosecutors couldn't prove intent, because juries didn't want to believe that a daughter could do this to her mother. And I knew something else. I couldn't yet prove that Bradley was in on it. And if he wasn't, I needed to find out before I destroyed his world too. "I need proof," I told Margaret as we sat in her kitchen. "I need to catch her doing it on camera. I need the bottle. I need a chain of evidence that no defense lawyer can poke holes in." Margaret looked at me like I'd grown a second head. "Eleanor, she's poisoning you. Every hour you stay in that house is another hour she could finish the job. She can't finish anything if I don't eat or drink what she prepares. And I have a plan." That afternoon, while Catherine and Bradley were at a networking event in Canada, Margaret and I installed 3 small cameras in the kitchen, one hidden inside a decorative teapot on the upper shelf, angled down at the counter. One tucked into the fake fern I'd never particularly liked anyway, facing the fridge and the cupboard where she kept the amber bottle. One in the smoke detector, looking at the entire room. They synced to the cloud. Margaret had a friend at a small Ottawa security firm who'd set it all up for a discount and asked no questions. I also contacted Helena Vasquez, the most formidable elder abuse lawyer in Eastern Ontario, a woman who'd built her career prosecuting cases like mine at the Ottawa courthouse. She heard me out and then said something I'll never forget. "Mrs. Whitmore, what you're describing is premeditated attempted murder. We're going to bury her." Over the next 11 days, I lived a double life that I wouldn't wish on anyone. Every morning, Catherine would bring me my smoothie. I would thank her, watch her leave, and pour it into a sealed container that Margaret would collect through the back door and transport to a private lab in Gatineau. Every cup of tea, every bowl of soup, every glass of water she handed me, I replaced with something I'd prepared in secret. I started losing weight, which I explained away as the new diet working. I pretended to get worse when she was watching, shuffling when I walked, complaining about the neuropathy. I wanted her to believe the poisoning was succeeding. The camera caught her every morning. 3 drops into the smoothie on Monday, a splash into the coffee on Tuesday, stirred into the oatmeal on Wednesday. She was patient, consistent, and utterly remorseless. Once she hummed while she did it. A Christmas carol. Because we were heading into the first week of December, I had to put down my book and breathe very slowly to keep from screaming. The lab in Gatineau confirmed thallium sulfate in every single sample. Margaret's pharmacy contacts helped me understand what I was dealing with. Thallium sulfate used to be available as rat poison until Canada banned it in the 1980s, but it could still be obtained from certain industrial suppliers, particularly those dealing with electronics manufacturing and specialty optics. Helena had her investigator trace suppliers, and within a week, they'd connected the dots. An order placed 6 months earlier from a shell company registered in British Columbia shipped to a P.O. box in Calgary. The paper trail led directly to Bradley. That's when I knew. My son-in-law wasn't just involved. He was the architect. The question became whether Catherine was a willing accomplice or a manipulated wife. I needed to know before I made my next move. One evening, when Bradley was supposedly in Toronto for meetings, I sat Catherine down in the living room. "I've been thinking about the will," I told her, watching her face with the careful attention of someone who'd interviewed thousands of suspects in her career. "I want to make some changes. I'm going to leave the house to the National Trust for Canada. They have a heritage program I'd like to support. You'll get my investments, which amount to about $300,000, and some personal items, but the house will be preserved as a public trust." What I saw in her face was not shock. It was not sadness. It was not confusion. It was rage. Pure, undiluted, calculating rage. It flickered there for only a second before she smoothed it away, but I saw it. I'd been watching for it. "Mum, that's a huge decision. Are you sure?" "Bradley and I? Well, we've always assumed, the house has been in the family, and with our own plans for the future." She caught herself. Adjusted. "Of course, it's your choice. Are you sure this is what Dad would have wanted?" My husband, who'd given 36 years of his life to protecting Canadian public lands, who'd wept when we visited Gros Morne together in '89, who'd wanted more than anything to leave something beautiful behind for the country he loved. I said very softly, "Yes, Catherine, it's exactly what your father would have wanted." She left the room in a hurry, and I heard her on the phone to Bradley within 30 seconds. The next morning, the dose in my smoothie was visibly larger. She was panicking. She was escalating. That was my signal to move. I met with Helena and Detective Inspector Amara Thompson of the Ottawa Police Service the following afternoon. I handed them everything. The video footage, time-stamped and cloud-verified, the lab reports, the supplier trace back to Bradley. The recording I'd made of Catherine's phone call to Bradley that night, captured on a recorder I'd left in the hallway, which caught her hissed words clearly. "She's changing the will. Everything goes to some heritage trust. We need to finish this, Bradley. I don't care what you have to do. I want it done by Christmas." Detective Thompson's jaw went tight. "Mrs. Whitmore, I've been doing this for 22 years, and I have rarely seen evidence this airtight. We're going to arrest them both. I need you out of that house today. Is there somewhere safe you can go?" I stayed with Margaret that night, and the night after, and the night after that. On the fourth morning, a team of officers executed simultaneous warrants at my house and at a storage locker in Calgary that Bradley had rented under a shell company. They found the amber bottle in the cupboard above my fridge. They found receipts, burner phones, a search history that included the phrases "thallium fatal dose elderly" and "how long after poisoning before estate settlement." They found Bradley's fingerprints on the supplier invoices. Catherine was arrested in the kitchen she'd been poisoning me in for 3 months. Bradley was arrested at his office on Elgin Street. Margaret and I watched from her living room window as the patrol cars pulled away, and I felt nothing like triumph. I felt only the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who'd been carrying a terrible weight and had finally been allowed to set it down. Then I had to make a phone call. I had to call my grandson Thomas, who was 22 and studying forestry at UBC, and tell him that his parents had both been arrested for trying to murder his grandmother. That was the hardest conversation of my life. He cried. I cried. He flew home the next morning and showed up at Margaret's door with a look on his face that was older than any 22-year-old should have to wear. "I always knew there was something wrong with him, Grandma," he said quietly, speaking of his father. "I didn't know about Mum. I couldn't have. I held him for a long time. He stayed with me for the rest of that winter. The trial took 14 months. Canadian justice moves at its own deliberate pace. Helena Vasquez was a force of nature in the Ottawa courtroom. She walked the jury through every piece of evidence with surgical precision. The video footage played on the screens, and I watched juror number 4 put a hand over her mouth. The recording of Catherine's phone call played, and juror number 7 wept openly. Bradley's lawyer tried to argue that Catherine had been coerced. Catherine's lawyer tried to argue that Bradley had manipulated her. The prosecutor, a Crown attorney named Joelle Tremblay, took both defenses apart piece by piece. She showed the jury that Catherine had purchased the shell company's initial paperwork with her own credit card. She showed the jury that Catherine had been present for every single supplier interaction. She played the audio of Catherine saying, "I want it done by Christmas," and let the words hang in the air. The jury took 6 hours. They convicted them both on attempted murder, conspiracy, fraud, and several counts related to the shell company and financial deception. At sentencing, Justice Margaret McLean of the Ontario Superior Court of Justice spoke directly to them. In 41 years on the bench, I have rarely seen a case so thoroughly documented, so chillingly premeditated, or so deeply corrosive to the sacred bond between parent and child. You did not simply attempt to murder your mother. You betrayed every principle of familial trust that holds our society together. You did so for money, and for that I find no mitigation possible. She sentenced Catherine to 22 years in federal prison. She sentenced Bradley to 25. Neither would be eligible for parole until they'd served a minimum of 15 years. Catherine did not look at me once during the entire trial. At sentencing, she finally turned her head, and what I saw in her eyes was not remorse. It was resentment. She blamed me, I realized. She blamed me for not simply dying on schedule. I held her gaze until she looked away. Afterwards, I did something that surprised even Helena. I filed a civil suit against Bradley's mother, a woman named Deirdre who lived in a penthouse condo in Yorkville. Text messages recovered from Bradley's phone showed that Deirdre had known about the inheritance scheme. She'd encouraged it. She'd made comments like that old woman is sitting on a fortune, and the sooner, the better. She'd helped Bradley register the shell company. The civil suit recovered $460,000. Every penny of it I donated to the Canadian Network for the Prevention of Elder Abuse and to the Ottawa Seniors Transportation Assistance Program, a small charity I'd worked with years ago that helped isolated elderly people get to medical appointments. Margaret and I cut the ribbon on a new van, the program purchased with part of the donation. It was painted cardinal red, like the birds in my garden. The story made headlines across the country. The Globe and Mail ran a front-page feature. CBC's The National did a 7-minute segment. Maclean's magazine published a long-form piece about the changing landscape of elder abuse in Canada. I gave one interview, and only one, to a journalist at the Ottawa Citizen named Sadie Kowalski, who promised me she would treat my story with dignity and use it to raise awareness about the warning signs of elder abuse. She kept her word. Her article won a national newspaper award. That was 18 months ago. I am 70 years old now, and I'm standing in my garden on a warm May morning, watching the cardinals fight over the feeder again. The roses Douglas planted in 1990 are blooming. The lilacs are in full riot along the back fence. My hair has grown back, thick and white and stubborn. The burning sensation in my feet has faded to a faint memory. I can climb my stairs without stopping to rest. I can outwalk most of the women in my bridge club, and I take a certain quiet pride in that. Thomas moved back to Ottawa after his graduation. He works for the Rideau Valley Conservation Authority now, protecting the watersheds his grandfather helped catalog decades ago. He comes for Sunday dinner every week. We cook together, in the same kitchen where his mother tried to kill me, and neither of us pretends the ghosts aren't there. We just choose to fill the space with better memories. I changed the will. The house will go to the National Trust for Canada when I'm gone, to be preserved as a small heritage property with a garden open to the public twice a year. Thomas will have the proceeds of my investments and a trust fund for his children, should he have any. I've told him gently that he does not need to visit his parents in prison on my account, but that I support whatever decision he makes. He has chosen so far not to visit them. I respect that. I do not judge it. Some nights I still wake up at 3 a.m, convinced I can hear Catherine in the kitchen, humming that Christmas carol as she stirs poison into whatever she plans to bring me. Then I remember, she is in a federal institution in Kitchener. She cannot hurt me anymore. I make myself a cup of chamomile tea in my own kitchen, from leaves I dried myself last summer, and I sit at the table watching the sunrise come up over my garden. I speak to senior groups now, at community centers across Ottawa and beyond. I drove out to a small town near Kingston last month to speak at a gathering of widows who'd lost their husbands in the past 2 years. I told them what I tell everyone. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. If a family member is suddenly very interested in your estate, pay attention. If you're being isolated from your friends, pay attention. If the person cooking for you doesn't want anyone else to cook for you, pay very careful attention. And please, please, keep a friend like Margaret in your life. A friend who will look at you across a kitchen table and say you look like a ghost and mean it with love. Because that friend may save your life. Margaret saved mine. A week ago, a woman named Gladys approached me after one of my talks. She was 82, a retired teacher from Sudbury. "My son's new wife has been making me special teas," she whispered. "I've been so tired lately. I thought I was just old. But now I don't know." I took her hands in mine. I gave her Helena Vasquez's card. I told her to call me that night, and I gave her my number. She did. We arranged for her to see a specialist in Toronto the following week. The tests came back showing elevated heavy metal levels in her system. She is safe now, living with her sister in Barrie, and her daughter-in-law is under investigation. I tell you this not to boast. I tell you this because it could be your mother, your grandmother, your neighbor, yourself. The warning signs are there if you know how to look for them. I water my garden every evening now, just as Douglas and I did for 40 years before he passed. The air in Ottawa in late spring has a particular sweetness to it, cut with the lingering cool of the Rideau Canal. I kneel in the dirt and pull weeds, and I think about how close I came to never seeing this garden bloom again. I think about how my daughter looked at me with those cold, calculating eyes and decided that my life was worth less than a $2 million heritage home. I think about Margaret, who saw what I couldn't see, who acted when others would have hesitated. I think about Thomas, who has chosen to love me and build a life near me despite the horror his parents visited on our family. I think about the quiet, unglamorous, deeply unfashionable virtue of paying attention to your body, to your instincts, to the people who love you, to the people who don't. Here is what I have learned, and what I will keep saying until I cannot say it anymore. Old age does not make you weak. Being targeted does not make you a victim. Fighting back, carefully and methodically, and with every ounce of intelligence you still possess, is what turns you into a survivor. I am a survivor. I am 70 years old. I have a garden, a grandson, a best friend across the fence, and more life left in me than anyone who tried to cut it short ever imagined. I intend to use every single minute of it.